There was a time when America didn't arrive quietly. It arrived in echoes, in the deep thunder of iron wheels, in the hiss of steam filling cathedral-sized halls, in footsteps rushing across marble floors polished by millions of lives in motion. Before highways carved the land and airports dominated the sky, these places were the beating hearts of the nation. Not just buildings, gateways to destiny. Immigrants clutched their futures here. Soldiers said goodbye here. Fortunes were made, lost, and rewritten beneath vaulted ceilings that seemed too grand for ordinary lives. These train stations were built to last forever. And yet, most of them didn't. Today, many stand abandoned. Some were demolished without ceremony. Others survive only as shadows of what they once were. Shopping malls, office spaces, or hollow shells filled with silence. What happened? How did the most magnificent public buildings America ever constructed fall into neglect, decay, and near erasure? This is not just a story about architecture. It's a story about ambition, arrogance, progress, and betrayal. About how an entire country changed direction and left its monuments behind. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, railroads were power. They were wealth. They were dominance. Railroad companies didn't just move people, they shaped cities, controlled economies, and dictated the rhythm of daily life. And their stations reflected that power. These were not utilitarian structures. They were palaces, designed by the greatest architects of their time, inspired by ancient Rome, Parisian opera houses, and European cathedrals, built with the belief that America was destined for permanence and grandeur. But beneath the marble and gold leaf, something fragile was forming. Because progress never asks permission. The automobile arrived quietly at first. Then highways spread like veins across the land. Air travel followed, faster, higher, indifferent to the cities it bypassed. And suddenly the temples of rail travel became inconvenient. What once symbolized the future began to represent the past. Railroad empires collapsed. Maintenance was deferred. Neighborhoods around the stations decayed, and one by one, these giants were abandoned. Not because they failed structurally, but because America no longer needed them, or so it believed. Some stations met violent ends, demolished in the name of progress. Others were saved at the last second, barely escaping oblivion. And a few became cautionary tales, reminders of what happens when a nation outruns its own memory. This video is the tragic journey of America's grand train stations, their rise, their fall, and the quiet warning they leave behind. Because when a society abandons its monuments, it's often abandoning something far more dangerous, its sense of direction. At the turn of the 20th century, America was intoxicated by motion. The nation was expanding faster than it could comprehend, westward, upward, outward. Cities grew violently, fueled by industry, immigration, and a belief so strong it bordered on religion. The future belonged to those who moved fastest. And nothing moved America faster than the railroad. Before skyscrapers dominated skylines, before freeways carved through neighborhoods, the most powerful structures in any major city weren't banks or government buildings. They were train stations. These were not designed merely to function. They were designed to impress. Railroad executives understood something fundamental about human psychology. Movement needed meaning. So they wrapped transportation in symbolism. Marble floors, soaring arches, bronze chandeliers, ceilings painted with constellations and mythological figures. A traveler didn't simply arrive. He was initiated. Nowhere was this philosophy clearer than in Grand Central Terminal. When it opened in 1913, it wasn't just the largest train station in the world, it was a declaration of dominance. The main concourse felt less like a transit hub and more like a Roman basilica. Natural light flooded the space through towering windows. The ceiling depicted a celestial map, suggesting that travel itself was cosmic, ordained. Every detail sent the same message. America is permanent. America is powerful. America is inevitable. And New York wasn't alone. In Chicago, Washington, Detroit, St. Louis, cities competed to outdo one another, pouring obscene amounts of money into stations that often generated little direct profit. That wasn't the point. Railroads were empires. Stations were their thrones. In 1910, railroads controlled nearly all long-distance travel and freight in the United States. Entire industries bent around train schedules. Towns lived or died based on whether the tracks passed through them. If your city had a grand station, you mattered. If it didn't, you were invisible. Perhaps the most tragic symbol of this era was Pennsylvania Station. Completed in 1910, it was a masterpiece of Beaux-Arts architecture, inspired by ancient Roman baths and European monuments. Its columns soared over 7th Avenue. Its waiting rooms were larger than city blocks. People didn't rush through Penn Station. They stood still. They whispered. They felt small and proud to be part of something larger. For immigrants arriving from Ellis Island, these stations were their first glimpse of America's promise. For soldiers leaving for war, they were places of last embraces. For families, they were thresholds, the point where lives divided into before and after. The station was not the journey, it was the ceremony, and ceremonies demand grandeur. Railroad companies justified the expense easily. They believed rail travel was eternal. No technology, they assumed, could rival the efficiency, scale, and reliability of steel tracks. They were wrong. But in that moment, the confidence was absolute. Stations were built with the assumption they would stand for centuries. Ironically, that confidence planted the seeds of their destruction. Because while America was building palaces for trains, something else was quietly forming. Something smaller, humbler, and far more dangerous. The automobile. At first it was dismissed. Loud, unreliable, and limited in range. A novelty for the wealthy. Rail executives laughed. They had rails. They had schedules. They had monuments. What they didn't have was flexibility. And flexibility, it turns out, reshapes civilizations. But that realization hadn't arrived yet. In the golden age of rail, America believed movement required ritual, that travel should feel monumental, that the future deserved marble, not asphalt. The stations rose as proof, and for a brief moment in history, they were right. The fall of America's grand train stations did not begin with explosions. There were no riots, no dramatic announcements, no moment when the nation gathered to declare the end of rail dominance. It began quietly, almost politely. In the 1920s, the automobile slipped into American life as a convenience, not a revolution. At first, it belonged to the wealthy, unreliable machines that rattled over dirt roads and broke down more often than they arrived. Railroad executives weren't worried. Why would they be? Trains were efficient, predictable, massive. Cars were individual, chaotic, small. But what railroads misunderstood was not technology, it was psychology. Americans were changing. The country that once accepted rigid schedules and shared spaces began to crave something else: control. The automobile didn't just offer transportation, it offered autonomy. Leave when you want, stop where you want, arrive without ceremony, no ticket counters, no waiting halls, no rules written by someone else. And slowly, that freedom rewired the American mind. By the 1930s, roads expanded. Gas stations multiplied. Motels appeared like stepping stones across the country. Entire industries reorganized around the car: oil, rubber, steel, advertising. Then came the turning point. After World War II, America returned home transformed. Millions of soldiers had experienced rapid movement across continents. Speed mattered now. Convenience mattered, and the country was flush with industrial confidence. In 1956, under President Dwight D. Eisenhower, the government launched what would become one of the most consequential infrastructure projects in human history: the interstate highway system. It was sold as defense, as efficiency, as progress, and it worked. Concrete arteries cut across the nation, connecting suburbs to cities, cities to cities, people to possibilities. Driving became effortless, fast, normal. Meanwhile, rail travel felt heavy. Stations demanded patience. Schedules demanded obedience. Shared space demanded compromise. The car demanded nothing. Air travel delivered the final blow. Commercial aviation matured rapidly after the war, fueled by military innovation and government investment. Airlines promised something railroads never could again: time compression. Cross the country in hours, not days. By the 1960s, flying was no longer exotic. It was aspirational, modern, clean. Railroads were suddenly old, and the stations, once symbols of the future, became symbols of stubbornness. The economics followed quickly. Rail passenger numbers collapsed. Revenue declined. Maintenance budgets were slashed. Grand stations, built to inspire awe, were expensive to maintain. Marble cracked, ceilings leaked, ornate details aged poorly without constant care. Rail companies under pressure began asking dangerous questions. Why maintain buildings that no longer generate profit? Why preserve grandeur for a public that no longer values it? Some stations were downsized, others were partially abandoned, and a few were quietly marked for removal. But the damage wasn't only economic, it was urban. Highways didn't just connect cities, and they carved through them. To make room for roads, entire neighborhoods were erased, often poor, often minority communities. The areas surrounding train stations, once thriving centers of activity, were among the hardest hit. What remained were isolated monuments surrounded by decay. Passengers stopped coming, businesses closed, crime increased, and the narrative flipped. What was once the heart of the city became something to avoid. By the late 1950s, Americans no longer passed through stations with reverence. They hurried. Or worse, they didn't come at all. And yet the most tragic part was this: no one intended to destroy them. There was no villain twirling a mustache, no singular decision that sealed their fate. Just 1,000 rational choices made in isolation. Drive instead of ride. Fly instead of wait. Build faster instead of preserving slower. Progress didn't attack the stations. It outgrew them. And in doing so, it exposed a truth that America would learn again and again. Civilizations don't lose their landmarks when they fail. They lose them when they succeed too quickly. As cars filled highways and planes filled skies, the stations stood still. Their scale became a liability. Their beauty became impractical. Their purpose became unclear. And once a society stops understanding the purpose of something, its destruction becomes inevitable. The question was no longer if America would abandon its grand stations, only how. And in some cases, how violently. Every decline has a moment when denial ends. For America's grand train stations, that moment arrived not with silence, but with wrecking balls. By the early 1960s, the idea that beauty deserved protection had lost its urgency. Cities were under pressure. Land was valuable. Cars demanded space. Developers promised efficiency, revenue, and modernization. And history stood in the way. The most devastating example unfolded in New York. The original Pennsylvania station, once considered one of the greatest public buildings ever constructed in the United States, was no longer profitable. Passenger numbers had collapsed. Maintenance costs soared. The railroad that owned it was drowning in debt. The solution, executives decided, was simple: destroy the station, sell the land above it, build something new, something useful. In 1963, demolition began. The public watched in disbelief as pink granite columns, each weighing hundreds of tons, were torn apart and hauled away like rubble. The vast steel and glass concourse was dismantled piece by piece. There was no fire, no collapse, just systematic erasure. Newspapers published photographs of angels carved in stone lying broken on the ground, faces cracked, wings shattered. One critic wrote that America would now enter the city like a rat through a hole. What was lost wasn't merely a building, it was confidence. For decades, Americans had believed their greatest works were permanent, that progress meant addition, not subtraction. Penn Station proved otherwise, and once it fell, the precedent was set. Across the country, other stations faced the same fate. Some were razed entirely. Others were mutilated, chopped into fragments, their grand halls replaced with drop ceilings, fluorescent lights, and commercial clutter. The logic was always the same. Why preserve something inefficient? Why protect the past when the future demands speed? But something unexpected happened. People revolted. Writers, architects, ordinary citizens. They began to articulate a feeling they hadn't yet named: loss without replacement. Among the loudest voices was Jane Jacobs. She argued that cities were not machines to be optimized, but living systems shaped by memory, continuity, and human scale. That destroying landmark severed something deeper than aesthetics. It severed identity. The demolition of Penn Station ignited a national reckoning. If a building of that magnitude could vanish, nothing was safe. The outrage led directly to the creation of the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission in 1965. Similar laws and boards followed across the country. Ironically, America only learned how to protect its monuments after destroying one of its greatest. But for many stations, the awakening came too late. By the time preservation gained momentum, dozens had already been erased. And those that survived did so narrowly, often seconds from demolition. The tragedy wasn't just cultural, it was symbolic. America had revealed a pattern that would repeat for decades: build something magnificent, abandon it when it becomes inconvenient, regret it only after it's gone. The new structures that replaced the stations rarely inspired awe. Concrete boxes, parking garages, sports arenas, functional, profitable, forgettable. They solved short-term problems while creating long-term emptiness. Cities grew faster but colder. Movement became efficient but meaningless. Travel lost its ceremony. And something else was lost too, something harder to measure: public space. Train stations were among the last places where rich and poor, immigrant and executive, soldier and child occupied the same grand room, where movement was collective, where anonymity and belonging coexisted. Cars separated people, airports standardized them, stations once unified them. Their destruction accelerated America's fragmentation. By the 1970s, rail travel had become an afterthought. Many surviving stations were surrounded by decay, treated as relics of a failed idea. And yet, beneath the dust and neglect, their power lingered. People still looked up when they entered, still lowered their voices, still felt something they couldn't explain, a reminder of what public ambition once looked like. The demolition of Penn Station didn't just erase stone and steel. It marked the moment America chose speed over soul, and didn't realize what it had traded away until the echo faded. The question now was whether the remaining stations would share the same fate, or whether America could remember what it once believed movement was supposed to feel like. Not every monument surrendered quietly. As the wrecking ball swung and cities erased their own history, a handful of train stations survived. Not because they were profitable, but because enough people refused to let them disappear. Their survival was never guaranteed. In fact, most came within inches of destruction. One of the most improbable rescues in American urban history occurred in New York, the very city that had just committed the unforgivable. After the demolition of Penn Station, public trust was shattered. People realized something chilling. No landmark was safe, not even the most famous. And looming over the city stood another giant: Grand Central Terminal. By the late 1960s, Grand Central was decaying. Passenger rail had collapsed. The terminal was filthy, neglected, and surrounded by rising real estate pressure. Developers proposed building a massive office tower directly above it, effectively suffocating the structure. To them, the terminal was wasted space. To preservationists, it was the last line of defense. The legal battle that followed became historic. Citizens argued that landmarks weren't obstacles to progress. They were anchors of continuity. That once destroyed, they could never be replaced, only regretted. The case reached the U.S. Supreme Court. In 1978, the court ruled in favor of preservation, affirming that cities had the right to protect landmarks, even if it limited private development. Grand Central survived, barely, but survival came with a price. It took decades of restoration to undo the damage caused by neglect. Layers of grime were peeled away. Ceilings were repaired. The terminal's original grandeur had to be rediscovered, almost archaeologically. Its rescue wasn't about nostalgia, it was about recognition. Recognition that some spaces are larger than economics. A similar struggle unfolded in Washington, D.C. Union Station had once been the ceremonial front door of the Capitol. Presidents passed through it. Soldiers departed from it. Its scale matched the gravity of the city it served. But by the 1970s, Union Station had become dangerous. Parts of it were abandoned. Crime spread. Calls for demolition grew louder. The proposed replacements were uninspiring. Parking lots, office blocks, anything but preservation. What saved Union Station wasn't profit, it was embarrassment. This was the capital of the United States. Allowing its grand station to rot was a public admission of decline. So it was restored, repurposed, and reintegrated into the city's life. Retail filled the halls. Trains returned. People came back, not just to travel, but to exist within the space. Elsewhere, survival took stranger forms. In St. Louis, the massive St. Louis Union Station avoided demolition only by abandoning its original purpose entirely. Trains left. Hotels arrived. Retail replaced rail. The building survived, but transformed. Was this preservation or surrender? That question haunts every saved station. Because survival in modern America often requires compromise. Some stations became museums. Others became shopping centers. Some were reduced to shells with their souls removed. Yet even altered, they continued to exert power. People felt something inside them when entering these spaces, even if they couldn't name it. Scale matters. Light matters. Silence matters. These buildings were designed to make individuals feel part of a collective journey. That sensation doesn't disappear just because the trains do. What separated the saved stations from the lost ones wasn't architectural superiority. It was timing. They stood just long enough for regret to arrive. Penn Station died before the country understood what it was losing. Grand Central survived because its twin's death was still fresh. Tragedy, it turns out, is an effective teacher, but only for those still standing. By the late 20th century, a pattern emerged. America would no longer build monuments like these, but it would reluctantly preserve the few that remained. Not because it wanted to return to the past, but because it sensed a void forming in the present. Airports were efficient but soulless. Highways were fast but isolating. Cities moved constantly but remembered little. The rescued stations became reminders of an older belief, that public spaces should inspire dignity, that movement should feel meaningful, that the future deserved beauty. Their survival didn't reverse history, but it interrupted the erasure. And in that interruption, America glimpsed an uncomfortable truth. Progress without memory is not advancement. It's drift. The stations that lived did so as warnings, not monuments to success, but evidence of a lesson learned too late. And as the 21st century arrived, a new question surfaced quietly beneath their vaulted ceilings. In a world that moves faster than ever, what have we stopped building, and why? In the end, America did not lose its grand train stations by accident. It outgrew them. And that distinction matters, because accidents provoke grief. Outgrowing something provokes justification. By the late 20th century, the nation had fully reorganized itself around speed. Faster commutes, faster deliveries, faster lives. Time became the ultimate currency, and anything that slowed movement was reclassified as waste. The stations had one unforgivable flaw. They asked people to pause, to wait, to gather, to feel the weight of departure and arrival. Modern systems don't tolerate that. Highways don't ask for reflection. Airports don't ask for belonging. Digital movement doesn't ask for presence at all. It simply moves. And in that shift, The stations became uncomfortable reminders of a value America no longer wanted to acknowledge: that not all progress should be invisible. The great stations were built during a brief historical window when nations believed infrastructure should do more than function. It should mean something. They weren't optimized for profit. They weren't designed for minimalism. They were designed to communicate a message across generations. You are part of something larger than yourself. That idea has become dangerous. In the modern world, scale intimidates. Permanence feels arrogant. Monuments invite scrutiny. So we stopped building them. Instead, we built systems that disappear the moment you stop using them. Apps, platforms, temporary spaces optimized for throughput, not memory. You don't remember a highway. You don't remember a terminal gate. You don't remember a login screen. But people remember stations. That's why they survived in the imagination long after they lost relevance in policy. Every restored concourse, every preserved arch, every salvaged clock stands as evidence of something modern life struggles to replicate: shared gravity. A place where strangers briefly became a collective. The stations didn't just move bodies. They synchronized lives. Everyone waited together. Everyone departed together. Everyone arrived under the same roof. That experience shaped behavior. It encouraged patience. It imposed humility. It reminded people they were not alone in motion. When America abandoned that model, it didn't just choose efficiency. It chose fragmentation. Cars isolated people into private capsules. Flights reduced travel to checkpoints and queues. Digital movement erased physical presence entirely. The journey became transactional, and with that, something subtle disappeared from public life. A sense of ceremony. The stations were rituals made of stone. They turned travel into transition, not just between cities but between identities. Before and after. Home and unknown. Modern systems skip that. They optimize away the human moment. And yet, despite everything, people still seek these places out. They don't have to. They go anyway. Photographers wait for light to flood old halls. Tourists stand silently beneath ceilings meant for crowds long gone. Commuters slow their pace without realizing why. The stations still work, just not as intended. They work as mirrors. They reflect a version of America that believed greatness should be visible, that public ambition mattered, that the future deserved beauty, not just efficiency. And that reflection is uncomfortable, because it raises a question no modern system wants to answer. If we no longer build places like this, what does that say about what we believe now? The tragedy of America's grand train stations isn't that many were destroyed. It's that the logic that destroyed them became normal. The belief that value must justify itself quarterly, that beauty must pay rent, that permanence is a liability. Those ideas didn't stop with stations. They reshaped cities. They reshaped institutions. They reshaped how people see the future. And yet the surviving stations stand quietly against that logic. They don't argue. They don't advertise. They don't demand. They simply endure. And in their endurance, they offer a final lesson. Progress that forgets where it came from eventually forgets where it's going. America once built cathedrals for movement because it believed motion deserved meaning. The stations rose as proof. Their decline marked a shift. Their survival, partial, imperfect, compromised, is a warning. Not about trains, but about what happens when a civilization moves faster than its memory can follow. And whether someday it will realize that the most tragic loss wasn't the buildings themselves, but the belief that built them. Long after the last train departs, a station never truly becomes silent. Sound behaves differently in spaces built for permanence. Footsteps linger. Voices bounce. Even emptiness has weight. Stand alone in one of America's grand stations late at night, and you'll notice something unsettling. The building still expects people. The benches face inward. The halls remain open. The clocks continue to mark time, even when no one is waiting. These places were not designed to shut down. They were designed to endure. That is why their decline feels unnatural. Abandoned factories make sense. Empty malls feel inevitable. But an empty station feels wrong, like a heartbeat without a body, because stations were never just infrastructure, they were agreements, unspoken contracts between a nation and its people, promising that movement had meaning, that departure mattered, that arrival was worthy of ceremony. When America turned away from that idea, it didn't replace it with something equivalent. It replaced it with speed. Speed doesn't create memory. Speed doesn't invite reflection. Speed doesn't leave echoes. It only leaves distance. In the 21st century, the contradiction became obvious. Technology allowed people to move faster than ever, yet feel less grounded than any generation before them. Cities expanded, but public life thinned. Connection increased, but presence declined. The stations, frozen in time, began to look less like relics and more like messages sent forward. Warnings written in stone. They asked uncomfortable questions. What happens when convenience becomes the highest value? What do societies lose when nothing is meant to last? And what replaces shared spaces when everything becomes private, optimized, and temporary? The answers weren't found in policy papers or planning committees. They were found in behavior. People kept returning to these places, not because they needed to travel, but because they needed orientation. They took photos. They met beneath clocks. They wandered without destination. The stations became sanctuaries for something modern life rarely offers: unstructured meaning. You didn't need to buy anything. You didn't need a purpose. You were allowed to simply exist, briefly, within something larger. That permission is rare now. Most modern spaces demand productivity, or consumption, or efficiency. The stations demanded only presence, and presence, it turns out, is fragile. As cities plan their futures, smart infrastructure, autonomous vehicles, frictionless transit, the old stations sit quietly in the background, observing. They have seen this pattern before. A new system arrives. It promises liberation. It optimizes everything. And then, slowly, it erases what made movement human. The tragedy of America's grand train stations is not that they were obsolete. It's that they were misunderstood. They were never competing with cars or planes. They were competing with forgetfulness. They anchored memory to motion. They slowed time just enough for meaning to form. When they were abandoned, America didn't just lose buildings. It lost a buffer against acceleration. And now, in a world that moves faster than ever, that loss is becoming visible. People feel unmoored. Cities feel interchangeable. Journeys blur together. Everything arrives, but nothing lands. The stations offered landing. They marked transitions. They acknowledged endings and beginnings. They allowed grief and hope to coexist under the same roof. Modern systems skip that. They deliver outcomes, not experiences. And so the echo remains. Not the sound of trains, but the echo of a belief that public life matters, that beauty in shared spaces matters, that a civilization should be recognizable in its architecture. America once believed that how you arrive says something about who you are. The stations embodied that belief. Their fall marked a shift toward invisibility, where movement happens but meaning doesn't accumulate. Their survival, however incomplete, suggests something else. That even after forgetting, societies remember. That regret has weight. That absence teaches. And that some structures outlive their original purpose because they were never built for a single function. They were built for humans. In the end, the story of America's grand train stations is not about trains. It is about tempo. About whether a civilization can move forward without outrunning itself. And whether someday it will decide to build places again that do more than move people. Places that make them feel where they are. Because the most haunting thing about these stations isn't their emptiness, it's that even now, they still feel like they're waiting.